Welcome and good afternoon. This is the second lecture of the 2023 Parchman Lectures. Our distinguished guest and lecturer is the Reverend Dr. John Swinton, who is professor in practical theology and pastoral care and chair in divinity and religious studies at the University of Aberdeen. He is also an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland. His three-part series is titled Seeking Sanctuary, Finding Shalom, a deeper, kinder, practical theology of mental health. Professor Swinton is published widely within the area of practical theology, disability theology, qualitative research, and pastoral care. I will not take the time to repeat his selected publications, though some of his works are on display and for sale in Truett's Narthex. One of the many ways, Dr. Swinton, that you've helped your students, your audiences, and your readers of your books is how you help others to see the world differently. For instance, you demonstrate how easy it is for us today to narrowly construe emotions such as joy and sadness when the Bible addresses the richness of psychological life that we all experience. Professor Swinton, we are grateful for how you offer us a theological imaginary that allows us to see and experience everyday life anew. This afternoon, Professor Swinton will build on his theological model for mental health in his second lecture titled Finding Peace with Creation, Culture, Politics, and the Land. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Friendly. This morning, just for anybody who wasn't here this morning, let me very briefly say that we were outlining an understanding of mental health based on the biblical concept of shalom. And within that, mental health is not understood as the absence of illness or suffering or distress, but the presence of God, even in the midst of that. And so mental health care is finding ways to hold on to God in the midst of the difficulties that we encounter. But the concept of shalom is an interpersonal thing, something that goes on within your own mind. And we looked at the idea of what we mean when we talk about the Western mind. It's an interpersonal thing that goes on to do with interconnections and harmony between people and between God. But it's also an intra-creation dynamic. In other words, it's what happens when these bodies and minds sit within creation and the way that these things interpenetrate that we want to look at this afternoon. So in the morning, we looked at the idea that the mind is porous, it's open to other, and we share our minds in particular ways. So the porosity of the mind that we explored in Lecture 1 makes us vulnerable and open to damage from others. That damage can be causal, as in the outcome of destructive relationships, or it can be consequential, emerging from the alienation that comes from stigma, misunderstanding, prejudice, or injustice. So remembering to love our neighbours' minds is a vital dimension of faithful mental health care. The porosity of our bodies and minds also leaves us vulnerable to changes beyond our immediate relationships. What goes on within creation, the place where our bodies and minds live, breathe, and have their being, deeply impacts upon our mental health. Disharmony within creation inevitably leads to disharmony within individuals and communities. So in this lecture, we'll examine the dimension of shalom in mental health that focuses on our relationships with creation and the ways in which a lack of care for creation is damaging for our mental health. So the first thing that we need to do is define what I mean by creation. When I talk about care for creation, I'm not simply talking about ecological issues, although, as will become clear, they're important aspects of mental health conversation. Creation encompasses the land upon which we place our feet, the air that fills our lungs, and the geographical places we carve out to live and to love in. Within these geographical spaces, there are visible aspects such as the physical state of the land, and also invisible aspects such as politics, economics, and culture. So when I talk about creation, I'm referring to all of these things. Lack of shalom in any of these aspects of creation leads to dissonance, instability, and mental ill health. So in getting into all of these dimensions of the issue, it'll be useful to, once again, ask the question, what is mental health? only this time from a different angle. So I want to begin with a rather unusual suggestion. A focus on mental health can be bad for your mental health. Recently, there's been a laudable movement away from discussing mental health issues primarily in terms of mental illness. The argument is that the term illness unnecessarily locates people within a medical paradigm. When this happens, the assumption is that dealing with mental health problems is something that is confined to the work of professionals. It's not that professionals' care is to be avoided, it's simply to note that this is not the only way in which people's experiences can or should be framed. The term mental illness suggests that recovery has to do with getting rid of symptoms. Those who favour mental health argue that this term offers a different form of recovery that's not determined by medicine or determined by your state of mind. To recover is to maximise your life goals, find the things that are most important to you, and learn to live a healthy life, even in the midst of experiences others might assume to be unhealthy. Of course, it's important to note that people should be allowed to name their experiences in whatever way they want. The point is not to develop a kind of language police which determines what language should be used. The point is to highlight that there may be different ways of articulating people's experiences than those offered by standard accounts. So this is potentially a positive move, but there's a problem. In an interview with the podcast Mad in America, titled "The Failings of Mental Health: How a seemingly benign concept might be dangerous," the sociologist Bruce Cohen notes that there are hidden dangers in emphasizing mental health. So he acknowledges the need to move away from the language of mental illness, primarily in the light of the ways in which mental health diagnoses seem to be expanding, turning problems of living into different forms of mental illness. We'll return to that point a little later. There's a real danger, Cohen argues, that all of us end up as defined as mentally ill. However, the movement towards mental health comes with equally concerning dangers. The insidious dimension of mental health discourse is that while some of us might be able to evade the label of mental illness, none of us can escape from the term mental health. But why, one might ask, would one want to escape from the term mental health? The idea of mental health is truly alluring, so why would you not want to develop it? Well, Cohen notes that we become used to seeing organizations having taglines such as "no health without mental health" and "mental health is everybody's business." These have become commonplace. It's not unusual to see workplaces holding mental health awareness sessions or schools instituting mindfulness classes. Every disaster crisis leads commentators and campaigners to say we need more targeted mental health services. And we have consumer products which are now sold to us on the basis that they are actually good for our mental health and our well-being. Now, none of this sounds immediately problematic, but perhaps it should. Cohen uses the example of his own university. There is the saying, "your well-being comes first." Many universities have taken up this mantle for staff, faculty, and students. During COVID, with the staff losses we had, it was still "your well-being comes first." We have a social wellness committee. It's established to help foster, it says, a positive workplace culture and environment that promotes staff wellness, that's both physical and mental, and is welcoming, inclusive and safe for all staff. And that's all very well, Cohen says. However, and this is where it gets political and serious for me, myself and my colleagues are basically expected to do more and more work over time with less resources. This is especially true over the past couple of years, but I would say that's going back for 5 to 8 years. We lost administrative staff, 2 or 3 in sociology. There's been a virtual freeze on new academic employment. Even our tea room was taken away from us. Now, the contradiction here is obvious. On the one hand, you have an institutional push emphasizing the importance of mental health, which acts as a facade, preventing people from recognizing and acknowledging that the real threat to people's mental health lies in the ways in which the organization as a whole is functioning, its economic priorities, its assumptions about the role and function of staff, and the pressures of meeting its own targets and goals. As Cohen puts it, how can chair massages take away the fundamental problems of institutional under-resourcing? So an emphasis on mental health thus becomes a way of enabling people to develop resilience to unjust, economically driven, people-unfriendly systems and poor working conditions, without acknowledging that these systems and settings are the very things that are causing people's languishing. So mental health is not just a good thing to have, it's an institutional expectation. Employees are expected to be mentally healthy at all times. The organization will help them to achieve some approximation of this by assisting them to adjust to the demands of the system. The motivation of the organization's mental health care may look like compassion, and those carrying out mental health care initiatives within them may themselves be deeply compassionate. However, the underlying institutional desire is for efficiency and productivity. If mental health really matters, that would be reflected in the workings of the whole organization and not only in special initiatives. And that takes us to the problem of resilience. One concept there is that's deeply tied in with the thinking of many around mental health is the idea of resilience. Churches, healthcare systems, businesses all find the need to develop resilience within their workforces. Resilience has to do with enabling people to deal with difficult situations and to flourish even in the midst of them. This, of course, is a worthy goal. Helping people to cope with a difficult situation is an important aspect of mental health care that should be encouraged. It is, however, open to distortion. Chaplain Chris Swift, in his essay, Compassion or Complicity, makes a telling observation. He says, chaplains always walk a fine line between the pastoral care of distressed people and the risk of making the intolerable tolerable. He offers the example of the workhouse chaplain. The workhouse chaplain, he says, and the workhouse master were designed to operate as good cop, bad cop. One the stern disciplinarian, the other the friend of the poor. Perceptive critique of this relationship arrived at the jarring description of the chaplain as the Sunday jailer. Now, that's not to suggest that chaplains are consciously complicit in such things. It's simply to point out the danger of compassion becoming complicity when one works within complex, profit-driven organizations. And we find something similar within healthcare systems. For example, the National Health Service in the United Kingdom describes resilience as a way of enabling individuals to bounce back from life's challenges. And this is what the document says. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, the ability to be happy and successful again after something difficult or bad has happened. Resilient people are not only able to handle a crisis in the moment more effectively, they're also able to recover and get back on their feet more quickly. Now, admirable and well-intentioned as such an approach may be, the idea that we find ways of enabling people to be happy in the midst of underfunded and broken system and to bounce back into an unjust and oppressive organization may not be the best way forward, either for the mental health of individuals or for the mental health of the organization. Yes, enabling resilience in difficult times may be necessary and important, but on its own, it's clearly not sufficient. So the problem with mental health, as we've been discussing it, stems from the fact that institutions such as healthcare, which should be focused on nurturing people's well-being for their own sake, have become markets in the same way as oil or steel are markets. This means that implicitly or explicitly, staff and patients are viewed as commodities to be utilized to maximize efficiency and productivity. So within such a cultural milieu, the focus of mental health initiatives inevitably falls on individual minds, with their welfare woven into a broader economic picture. Even at this stage, we can see the contrast between this way of thinking about mental health and the model of shalom as mental health laid out in Lecture 1. When we place these insights into the problem of mental health within the context of society more generally, the dissonance becomes even sharper. The question here is Western culture bad for your health? So it's well documented that mental health challenges vary across cultures. Conditions such as depression, anorexia, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, all manifest themselves differently across cultures in terms of symptoms, behaviour, and care and responses. Whilst there's a tendency, as Ethan Waters puts it, to globalise the Western mind, that is, to export ways of thinking about mental health developed in the West based on a Western understanding of the mind, and assume that they should apply everywhere. People across cultures actually have different interpretations of mind and different ways of thinking about mental health. And these differences are not unimportant. The fact that recovery rates from some conditions, such as schizophrenia, are better in non-Western cultural contexts raises the question of why this might be. Something we'll look at more clearly, more fully in Lecture 3, but we're going to touch on it now. What might be the reasons for such cross-cultural differences? In his work on the history of anorexia, the historian Edward Shorter developed the metaphor of the symptom pool to explain the different ways in which conditions are understood across time and across cultures. Every culture has a pool of symptoms which is available to members of that culture. Members of that culture can choose, mainly via unconscious processes, which symptoms they will utilize to manifest their mental health experiences. Conditions rise and decline as people learn to pay attention to them in different ways or cease paying attention to them at all. So in his book, Mad Travellers, the philosopher Ian Hacking explored the brief appearance in the 1890s of a fugue state in which European men would walk in a trance for hundreds of miles with no knowledge of their identities. These symptoms later disappeared, and the condition seems no longer to exist. Because these symptoms are no longer available, it ceased to be an option for people. In his work on depression in Taiwan, the anthropologist Arthur Kleinman discovered that due to the fact that mental health issues were highly stigmatized within Taiwanese culture, people somaticized their depression. That is, they manifested through their bodies to vague aches and pains and backache. Westerners articulate their depression through talk about their emotions, feelings, levels of melancholy, and so forth. People in Taiwan articulated the same or similar feelings via vague stomach or back pains. So the symptom pool available to Taiwanese people was shaped by cultural attitudes to mental health. Having a condition of the body was deemed to be less stigmatizing than having a condition of the mind. Along similar lines, Puna Apeliog found that that feelings of guilt that is normally associated as a core feature of depressive thinking is less common in cultures that have a collective system of meaning than it is within individualistic societies. And interestingly, Chaplain Ian McRitchie found that guilt was more prominent among Scottish Calvinists who experienced depression than other denominations. No great surprise there. So people tend to gravitate towards symptoms that are high on the scale of acceptable possibilities within any given culture. The historian of science, Anne Harrington, points out that such symptom adaptability is a necessary function for humans as cultural beings. To quote her, she says, "Our bodies are physiologically primed to be able to do this, and for good reason. If we couldn't, we would risk not being taken seriously or not being cared for. Human beings seem to be invested with a developed capacity to mold their bodily experiences to the norms of their culture. They learn the scripts about what kinds of things should be happening to them as they fall ill and about the things they should do to feel better. And then they literally embody them. So recognizing this symptom adaptability helps us to understand why mental health challenges manifest themselves differently over time and place. So the process of symptom choosing and symptom formation is not neutral. Those who are seeking to minister to the mentally unwell, be they doctors, ministers, shamans, or whomsoever, implicitly or explicitly encourage people to adopt certain symptoms and to disregard others. Take, for example, myocardial encephalitis, ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. For many years, people with the symptoms of ME, extreme tiredness, slow recovery after activity, problems sleeping, were not accepted as genuinely unwell by the medical profession. It took many years of fighting before this syndrome was accepted and officially came into existence. Another example of symptom formation and replacement within the realm of the spiritual would be ascribing the demonic to the symptoms of psychosis. Here, the standard psychiatric explanations of a person's symptoms, stroke experiences, are rejected and replaced by another set of symptoms drawn from a religious tradition. In this way, a new set of symptoms is introduced to the symptom pool. Powerful people attribute this set of symptoms to vulnerable people who may feel compelled to accept it with dangerous consequences. Medication is rejected, spiritual treatments such as exorcism become the assumed norm, etc., etc. So adding to the symptom pool is not necessarily a positive thing. The symptom pool is thus seen to be dynamic, expanding and contracting in response to both lay and professional interpretations and understandings. And as a side note, you can begin to think about how social media feeds into that as people create new symptoms and learn about other symptoms in a globalized context. So changes to the symptom pool are not always in response to new scientific developments. It sometimes changes as people change their opinions. So the regular modification of mental health challenges in the diagnostic criteria, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorder, are a good example of this. So homosexuality ceased to be a mental illness in 1973, following pressure from gay rights groups, not following new scientific information. In 1980, PTSD became a diagnosis, following pressure from groups who worked to raise attention and support those exposed to trauma. Asperger's was, by consensus, taken out of the recent DSM-5, meaning that officially it no longer exists. It's subsumed into a broader category of autism. What some consider to be normal experiences are now reclassified as diagnoses. So this is Cohen's point. Being poor at mathematics becomes dyscalculia. Grieving for longer than the period of time laid down by the psychiatric community becomes prolonged grief disorder. The symptom pool is thus seen to be expanded or contracted, depending on how those with the power to name symptoms decide to frame people's experiences, issues at any given moment in time. And this, of course, again, was Cohen's fear in relation to the term mental illness. So we can now begin to see how and why the kind of focus on mental health we discussed earlier places a certain interpretative slant on the symptom pool available to people working within organizations. It internalizes the causality and shapes the symptoms, making them a matter of personal welfare. When powerful organizations choose to name stress and anxiety in the workplace as symptoms of individual psychological malfunctioning, this places a certain interpretation on the cultural symptom pool, focusing attention on individual minds and away from corporate failures. It also enables people to choose this way of naming their experiences, which may be part of the reason why stress and anxiety are so prevalent, i.e. people choose or are encouraged to name their problems in their lives that are actually out of their control, to name these as symptoms of personal pathology. When, for example, we discover that rates of anxiety and depression among students are rising, we might be wise to ask not only what is wrong with them, but also what is wrong with their environment. So their pathology may be mirroring a wider cultural pathology. So the focus on the symptom pool helps us to understand why mental health challenges look different across cultures. Different cultures have different theories of mind, different symptom pools, and different responses to symptoms. It also shows very clearly how culturally bound Western understandings of mental health care are. We have a particular view of mind, a particular way of developing the symptom pool, and a particular way of responding to mental health issues, which tends to focus on individual rather than corporate symptoms and pathologies. So what are these pathologies that we might discover within Western culture? It will be helpful to look at the suggestion in a little bit more depth. Western cultures have reshaped the symptom pool in quite specific ways. So I touched on something of this process above. There's, however, an overarching aspect of culture that we need to notice, and that relates to the connection between mental health, symptom formation, and the ideology of our political and economic structures. Those of us in the West live in a society or societies that have been deeply impacted by the ideology and the anthropology of neoliberal economics. The sociologist of religion, Matthew Guest, in his work on neoliberalism and religion, explains neoliberalism as referring to a set of cultural conditions indebted to the principles of neoliberal economics. These conditions may be summarized as a heightened individualism that prioritizes the freedom of the consumer over shared identities, a taken for granted assumption that market competition is the best measure of value, and a tendency to treat cultural objects as commodities. So neoliberalism is not only an economic system, but it's an ideology and it's a worldview. And it's that ideological and that worldview dimension that I want us to focus on here. A neoliberal worldview is marked by heightened individualism within which people define themselves in terms of freedom from others rather than freedom for others. Competition, which involves pitting one person against the other in every dimension of life and society. Commodification, the practice of turning everything into a commodity that can be bought and sold. And globalization, the way in which technology has made the world deeply interconnected and interdependent. It's easy to see how those within the system who are unable to meet these criterion will struggle to find sources of respect, value, and self-worth. It's also easy to see how the implicit anthropology of this system stands in stark tension with the interpersonal model of personhood I offered you in Lecture 1 that seems to sum up Paul's understanding of what it means to live well. It's therefore unsurprising that there's a close connection between neoliberalism and the kind of mental health vulnerabilities experienced by groups exposed to its consequences. Race, class, gender, ethnic background have all been shown to be affected by the negative consequences of neoliberal economics and its accompanying worldview. If economic success is a criterion for value in the good life, not to succeed is not to be valued. To fail in life. Worse, if you fail because of the inbuilt push against collectivism and the shrinking of intervention, there won't be the kinds of safety nets in place that you might need. Even worse, people will blame you for your situation. If mental ill health is perceived as a personal weakness, you will have nowhere to turn and no one to blame except yourself, because everything that has gone wrong within your cranium. Within this system, corporate pathogens manifest themselves in individual minds. Not surprisingly, the worldview and its accompanying practices that come with this are shaping and adding to the symptom pool. In his book, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, pastoral theologian, offers an important critique of neoliberalism as it relates specifically to pastoral care. One of his key points is that neoliberalism is changing the shape of suffering. He calls this change third-order suffering. So first-order suffering relates to things like death, grief, illness, conflict, pain, and so on and so forth. In previous times, people have dealt with this collectively through shared narratives, rituals, and so forth. Second-order suffering, he says, has to do with individual or corporate acts of evil, murder, war, violence, deception, racism, sexism, and so on. These kinds of suffering have tended to form the primary focus for pastoral theology. Third-order suffering, Rogers Vaughan says, is a new kind of suffering caused by problems created by neoliberalism, or the worldview that's created by that, and its tendency to reduce and fragment human subjects. According to Rogers Vaughan, people are left in a state of anomie. Without strong, vibrant collectives to support them, he says, individuals are more or less left to their own devices to deal with distress. We might describe them as a state of spiritual homelessness. These unfortunate souls are abandoned, left to interpret their suffering as signs of personal failure. They are not guilty, they are ashamed. They do not have an adequate narrative resources at hand to understand, to make sense of their suffering. They are left simply with market-generated narratives of personal recovery, which, like insulin for the diabetic, are perpetually fragile in the face of what they are up against. Such narratives are window dressing, a veneer of order imposed over what once would have been a durable sense of self. The terms used to describe first and second order suffering now fail them, largely because the sources of their suffering are no longer easily identified. The oppression, for example, no longer has faces, even the impersonal faces of the state, the corporation, or the church. Yet to say the oppressor is some abstract evil seems not to capture things. So people suffer in a strange, anomic, narrative-starved state that some have noted is a significant driver for not only for forms of anxiety and depression, but also for suicide. Importantly, third-order suffering is changing the shape of first and second-order suffering. Depression is becoming more diffuse and unfocused. Anxiety is becoming more and more amorphous. Addiction is more fluid and vaguer. The answer to the big question, who am I, where do I come from, where am I going, and why, are defined in relation to the presence or absence of personal success, which is mediated via the fluctuations of the market. Even when a person is doing well, they may suffer from new forms of anxiety, such as recession anxiety, a form of anxiety that comes from being at the mercy of the markets and knowing that everything you have you could lose in an instant if the economy goes bust. People are experiencing a diffuse and fragmented self, defined not by any forms of real-life community or collectivist activity, but by themselves. But even self-definition has become complicated. With the rise of social media and the constant push to gauge one's success according to how other people gauge you, reds, hearts, thumbs up on your social media page, your sense of self is always at risk in the marketplace of external observers who may buy into your personal presented self-image, but who also threaten to cancel you at any moment in time. This leads to overwhelming anxiety and depression, the source of which cannot be named. So in such circumstances, it's easy to begin to assume that the source of my failure is not external, that it must be internal. I am the problem. Despite the fact that the problem may, as we have seen, lie within the structures of wider society, shame in the face of personal failure is a burden that many people find difficult to bear. And of course, our mental health responses tend to aim towards individuals rather than cultural change, running the risk of reinforcing the sense of the interpersonal locus of pathology. So creating the conditions for the internalization of social problems, building a model of personhood that is dependent on winning at all costs and failing to offer a meaningful narrative to explain people's anomie, anxiety, fear, and depression are significant ways in which neoliberalism has been changing the symptom pool. It's not that things like anxiety and depression are new. The point is that within this particular social structure and worldview, they take on a specific shape and form, which requires different, perhaps more corporate kinds of intervention. But symptoms are not only being revised and reconfigured within a neoliberal worldview, new symptoms are being brought into existence. We saw in Lecture 1 that we are designed to live in harmony, to live in shalom, to live with one another and to live with creation. To live into shalom is to care well for one another and to take care of creation. Disruption in our relationships with creation will bring about disruption in other areas of our lives. One of the consequences of a neoliberal worldview is that the sacredness of creation fades as the land, the seas, and the skies become viewed as commodities to be bought and sold, exploited and controlled. The commodification of creation has seen the degeneration of ecosystems across the globe, the depletion of natural resources such as water, air, and soil, the destruction of the rainforests, the acidification of our seas, the mass extinction of species, and unprecedented floods, hurricanes, fires, and other disastrous events caused by changes in our climate. This destruction of the land, seas, and skies inevitably has an impact on people's mental health, something that is well documented in various reports produced by the American Psychological Association, for example. This ecological destruction has brought with it new configurations of symptoms and the formation of new conditions. For example, we now talk about eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. Eco-anxiety is a redirection of previous forms of anxiety and a significant reconfiguration of the symptom pool. These forms of anxiety are marked by a sense of panic, worry, fear towards the consequences of ecological damage. The two are not exactly the same, as to be anxious about the ecological state of the world does not necessitate the acceptance of the theory of climate change. Eco-anxiety is shaped by our environment, by the media, by social media, and other sources of knowledge, and is particularly strong amongst young people. We do not have to directly be involved with ecological damage. We just have to be aware of it. The commodification and damaging of creation has also added to the symptom pool in interesting ways. The Australian environmental philosopher Glenn Albrecht posits the idea of solastalgia. Solastalgia as a way of articulating the experience of those whose lives have been devastated by radical changes within their environment. So his original focus was on the experiences of Indigenous Australians and rural farmers, both of whom were faced with profound ecological change and the deliberate destruction of their land for profit. As the ecosystems within which these people lived and worked came under stress, they began to experience significant psychological and existential distress. Albrecht noted that in the face of ecological destruction, people experience what eco-philosopher Edward Casey names as place pathology, a form of existential loneliness that comes when one loses one's sense of place. Now, Casey was thinking about displaced people, but Albrecht noticed that this kind of place pathology was present in people who were still at home, still in the same places, but could no longer recognize or feel connected to that place. The symptoms of this place pathology include a particular form of anxiety, depression, hopelessness, and existential emptiness. They were at home in their land, but their land no longer felt like home. The term solastalgia contains a ghost reference to nostalgia, nostos, return home, algia, pain or sickness, and combines this with the idea of solace, the alleviation of distress. and desolation, abandonment, and loneliness. So solastalgia represents the pain or sickness caused by the loss or lack of solace and a sense of isolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. Now, the idea of solastalgia is not confined to the experiences of Indigenous people or rural Australian farmers. Solastalgia can emerge in any context where someone's place identity comes under threat of change or destruction. It is most powerful when people see the destruction of the land firsthand. As I wrote these lectures, Europe was being ravaged by fires that had destroyed homes, businesses, and lives. And Hawaii has recently experienced its worst fires. The worst fires constitute the worst natural disaster in its history. Floods in Canada, hurricanes in California, pollution, plastic seas, and so the list goes on. All of these events lead to the destruction of the land, of business, of farms, of lives for those who come into contact with such destruction. Now, my sense is that many people across the world are experiencing solastalgia at the moment. And in an age of mass media, all of us are exposed to the eco-pain of the world, and all of us are open to the experience of solastalgia, either in person or by proxy. Many of us struggle to feel at home in a world that is constantly changing, a place that is home but not home, a place that is commodified but has lost its soul. The introduction of the concept of solastalgia and its accompanying symptoms offers us a new way of thinking about eco-destruction and presents a new set of symptoms to look out for and to deal with. Feelings of homelessness at home. So in conclusion, mental health care based on shalom requires that we look at each dimension and offer care to each dimension. In this lecture, we've looked at the wider social, political, economic, and ecological dimensions of mental health and mental health care. There's no question that we need to develop mental health care strategies that deal with individual problems and challenges. That's a given, and there's a wealth of pastoral and theological literature that helps us to engage in this vital task. Nevertheless, if we simply deal with individuals rather than examining the things that make individual minds sick, we risk placing sticking plasters over large, bleeding wounds. We need to look inwards, outwards, and upwards at precisely the same time if we're to care faithfully for people's mental health. The final lecture tomorrow will begin to tease out some of the ways in which we might go about doing that in practice. But for now, the second dimension of shalom is what we keep in mind. Looking inwards, looking outwards, and ultimately looking upwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Swinton, once again, for a rich presentation. We very much look forward to tomorrow. Thank you very much for coming. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock will be our final lecture, and we hope that you'll join us again. Thank you very much. We are dismissed.